Hello. Finally, here it is. I'm going to get this last of these three short videos up on trends in assimilation and pluralism post 1965 in the United States. I want to talk today a little bit about Native Americans, specifically Wounded Knee, the American Indian movement, and a kind of militant separatist strategy that was employed. All right. So, unlike the Chicano movement, and mostly in distinction from the Black Power movement, although the Black Power movement did have some of these elements, the American Indian movement, Native Americans, took an explicitly separatist approach in their kind of their protest and activism in this post 1965 post civil rights period. And we'll talk a little bit about the degree to which there were successes and failures from this movement. But as you've probably already figured out from the chapter and from the previous lectures, separatist strategies almost never work. And this is one of those instances where we would have to concede that given their stated goals, at the end of the day, the American Indian movement probably didn't achieve most of their objectives. All right, so let's go back in time a little bit to the beginning of this movement. 1968 is when the American Indian movement begins. The working goals of the movement include self-determination and sovereignty, also a return to treaty making, following what were called the Indian termination policies. This I'll get into again in just a moment and talk about. But Indian termination policies, the latest round of those in the 1950s, triggered an activist and protest response on the part of Native Americans. And then, of course, the final working goal included ending racism and civil rights violations against American Indians. All right, so let me say a quick thing about termination. So, as you can imagine, the history of Native Americans and Alaskan Natives in the United States and in the pre-United States British colonial period, as well as Spanish colonialism and French colonialism, which was occurring elsewhere in the North American continent. This is a very long and it is a very complicated history. So, in no way, shape, or form is this, relatively brief video going to be able to do it justice. But I'm going to try to hit some of the quick highlights. So, from 1832 until 1871, in the United States, American Indian nations were considered sovereign. They were kind of countries within a country. This meant that the U.S. government, in their dealings with Native Americans, were compelled to do so through making treaties. That's how international relations, or the relations between nations, that's how international relations are conducted, through treaties and agreements. In 1871, the Indian Appropriations Act, passed through the U.S. Congress and signed into law, voided that expectation. So following 1871, right, following the implementation of the Indian Appropriations Act, individual tribes are no longer recognized by the United States. Native Americans are certainly still here, but the tribes, the sovereign nations that they sort of represent, have kind of just sort of gone away. The United States is still obligated to honor agreements, right? So it doesn't void the binding agreements that the nations entered into, but that obligation over time sort of sunsets. So by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, in essence, Native American tribes have kind of they've sort of disappeared as legal entities, as sort of independent sovereign nations. That process continues into the 1900s. So in the 1900s, there's another phase of Indian termination policies that begin in the 1940s. And it's these termination policies, this latest round of termination policies beginning in the 1940s, at the same time as we see the emergence of the civil rights movement broadly within the United States, that appears to have been the catalyst for creating the American Indian movement. And there are four. Now, there were lots of examples of activism. I've picked four notable examples of American Indian movement activism and protest that kind of came about in response to these changes. The occupations of Alcatraz, Trail of Broken Treaties, the occupation of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and the Longest Walk. So I'm going to walk just really, really quickly through each of those and sort of hit some of the highlights. There were other examples of American Indian activism. There were other ways in which the broad American Indian community, even outside of AIM, tried to pursue and continue to this day to try to pursue establishing certain conditions for Native Americans and Alaskan Natives. So let's start with the occupations of Alcatraz, because there were more than one. So in 1969, from 1969 until 1971, there were three different occupations of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The island had the prison on the island had closed in 1963, and the interpretation of a number of different laws that had been agreed to, treaties that had been signed with between Native Americans and the U.S. government, sort of said that once the government kind of abandons land that used to belong to Native Americans can move back in and occupy it, and that's what happened in 1969. So in 1969, there were three separate occupations. The last one lasting the longest, I think something like 19 months. The idea here was that the occupation of Alcatraz Island would generate attention and media focus. In the light of that attention and media focus, these activists would make demands, which would include sort of rolling back some of the latest iterations of that termination policy that I was just talking about, right? That overall, again, the whole idea is this movement is trying to reestablish American Indian sovereignty and compel the government to have to go back into a system in which they're obligated to make treaties, that they're obligated to negotiate with the Native American population. The occupation comes to an end without any of those concessions being made. The next large piece of demonstration or activism was what was called the Trail of Broken Treaties. This happens in 1972, and the idea was, among the people who organized this, is that caravans would move from the west to the east, ultimately ending up in Washington, D.C., again, to bring attention to both treaty rights that were being eroded, but also the importance of a return to treaty making. Along the way, of course, they would stop in Native American communities to build support and solidarity, to collect resources, membership, and things of that nature. The plan was to present something called the 20 Points Position. You can just look this up, but the 20 Points Position paper was a document that kind of expressed the grievances and the concerns and the demands of the American Indian movement. The idea was that this document would be presented to both Richard Nixon and George McGovern, who were the two candidates running in the presidential election that would be held later that fall. When the Trail of Broken Treaties caravans arrive in Washington, D.C., it is only to discover that both Nixon and McGovern are out of town. Also, it turns out that their housing arrangements had kind of fallen through or had been sort of somehow sort of undermined or interfered with. And through a series of kind of misunderstandings and suspicion, the end result turned out to be a 6-day occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building. The national headquarters for that particular government agency is in Washington, D.C., and it was then subsequently occupied by these people from the American Indian movement. Again, the occupation comes to an end with no real major concessions, which leads us to 1973 and the occupation of Wounded Knee. Now, one of the other issues that is coming up a lot in American Indian communities at this time is the degree to which their internal leadership is corrupted, in part by its relationship with the federal government and with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Pine Ridge Reservation in North Dakota and the Oglala Sioux. This is no different. There's a guy in charge who is widely seen by the American Indian movement as corrupt, very deliberately and intentionally sort of shutting down any attempts to organize a more militant or confrontational form of American Indian activism. And so as a result of that, these activists end up occupying Wounded Knee, which was the site of a massacre back in the 1800s, as a kind of a symbolic gesture to sort of force a confrontation, again, over these issues of treaty making and sovereignty, but also, of course, of the removal of corrupt Indian leaders in favor of people who would be actively working on behalf of the interests of American Indians. So the occupation lasts for about 4 months, not quite 4 months. It begins in February of 73, and it comes like late February, comes to an end in very early May of 1973. May 9th, I believe, was the date that it came to an end. During the occupation, the FBI, federal marshals, and the National Guard blockaded the occupied town and made it very difficult for supplies to be brought in. There were gunfights, there were sort of confrontations along the way. 2 Native Americans were killed, 1 FBI agent was shot and paralyzed. At the end of the occupation, the occupiers agreed to surrender. Over 300 activists were arrested. In the wake of that surrender, people who had been in the occupation who had outstanding warrants in other areas were arrested on those charges as well. So a lot of arrests kind of continued to occur even after the actual occupation of Wounded Knee came to an end. And again, a lot of people saw this, but at the end of the day, the actual goals of the movement don't end up getting established or addressed as a result of the occupation of Wounded Knee. Finally, 1978. This is sort of the last major activity of the American Indian movement as a movement. And I'll talk a little bit more about activism in the post-AIM period in just a moment. But this was the moment of sort of the last big protest, and the protest was called the Longest Walk. So 1978, a 3,000-mile march, about 3,000 miles, to Washington, D.C., once again to sort of draw attention to Native issues along the way, building solidarity, building support, gaining media attention. The immediate issue that was sort of on the table was a desire to halt the passage of about 11 pieces of legislation that would have a very adverse impact on treaty rights, right? The rights that were still in place and that had been established. Even those now were threatening to be kind of eroded by these acts that were kind of working their way through the federal government. That actually happened. They actually succeeded in all of these pieces of legislation ultimately just sort of dying. A nice piece of some limited degree of success. Now, again, this was sort of, as I said, the last large sort of demonstration or activism organized by AIM, but these longest walks actually still continue. So that it turned out to be a relatively effective way for people to draw attention to Native American issues. And as a result, they don't happen every year, but they do happen periodically. I think the last one was in 2016. So these kinds of large-scale demonstrations do still occasionally occur. So the two broad achievements of all of this activism and all of this protest on the part of the American Indian movement mostly, as I said, resulted in a failure to achieve their goals. So they failed to, restore sovereignty and treaty rights. Those are still not present. They failed to be free Indian organizations from government control, right? Most organizations that sort of deal with the day-to-day management of the affairs of American Indians are still sort of squarely in the space of the federal government. So the idea of a kind of pluralist idea of establishing structural pluralism in which organizations overseeing the affairs of the United States and organizations overseeing the affairs of Native Americans would be two separate things. That, of course, did not come to pass. And C, they failed to achieve or to establish, I should say, national Indian voting. So the idea was that part of the way that Native Americans would be able to sort of continue to exercise political power is to focus on electoral power and the way that would work. One of the threats of termination was that as these sovereign nations ceased to sort of be sovereign, the Native American population, the American Indian population, would eventually just get kind of absorbed and assimilated into the broader mainstream culture and lose political power, but also potentially begin to lose their cultural identities as well. That is one of the places where the American Indian movement had some limited degree of success, right? Reviving American Indian culture and reviving an attention that be paid to American Indian culture sort of comes about as a result of all of this. People sort of noticed. So they drew attention to the issues of sovereignty and treaty making, the government control of Indian organizations, the relative adverse impacts of termination. So there was a lot of attention drawn to that, and that's arguably also a success. But the one place where they did have sort of a longer lasting impact, aside from killing 11 pieces of legislation, was actually a sort of revitalization of American Indian culture. So there you go. You've got I think 3 really good solid examples of what pluralism, separatism sort of looks like in that post-1965 era, in which the intergroup dynamic begins to sort of really shift away from assimilation models, whether it's sort of a melting pot amalgamation or an Anglo-conformity model of assimilation. Those approaches are increasingly losing out to pluralist approaches that recognize sort of cultural diversity has value in itself, as we've said before, and to some extent placing structural features of local communities, local racial or ethnic communities, placing them under the control of people in the community, a kind of, as I said, a kind of structural pluralism. That does sort of get a little shot in the arm as a result of all of this. I still believe, and I think the case can be made, fairly strongly that the current dynamic in the United States is predominantly structural assimilation and cultural pluralism. Those are the two main sort of thrusts. But we see here in the actions of more engaged and activist members of these communities efforts to sort of carve out space where those things can unfold in ways and operate in ways that are probably more favorable to the vast majority of the members of these communities than a sort of strictly assimilationist or Anglo-conformity approach would have resulted in. So it kind of multiculturalism made possible by having an even more dramatic example of separation over here on the side as a kind of less attractive alternative to something that looks like sensible middle ground to most people. So again, a lot of stuff gets left out here, as it always does in these kinds of conversations, but I hope this gives you a really good sense of overview. If you have any questions, of course, let me know, and I will see you the next time. Take care.